Welcome everyone to today's session of the workshop. As I mentioned in the morning session, this is the fourth in a series of quarterly workshops that we've been hosting at the Central Bank of Armenia. That's originally gone under the title of Central Bank Macro Modeling Workshops. This is actually in the 26th iteration, so it's been going on for 26 years now. And this was first launched by the Reserve Bank of New Zealand in the late 90s as a way to really get policymakers, people involved in policy, academics and so on, kind of all together in the same room to discuss key issues related to policymaking frameworks. And over the years, it's served as kind of a really helpful platform to discuss issues related to macro modeling and to frameworks at large. But this year, and in particular for this current iteration, which is our kind of final one for 2023, we've taken the opportunity at the Central Bank of Armenia to really kind of shift the focus of the workshop just a little bit to focus more on the question of frameworks. And in particular, you know, we at the Central Bank of Armenia have been involved in the development of FPAS Mark II, which is the kind of latest evolution of the forecasting and policy analysis system, which we'll talk about throughout this session. And the idea is for this workshop to really focus a little bit on some of these more kind of high level and fundamental kind of foundational issues related to good policymaking frameworks, not just for monetary policy, but also thinking about linkages with fiscal and macroprudential as well. So we have an exciting lineup here today. We have with us, of course, the governor of the Central Bank of Armenia, Martin Galistyan, who I'll pass the floor to in just a second. We also have with us Charles Goodhart, who has been a seminal figure in kind of the development of monetary economics over the past half century, of an illustrious career at the London School of Economics and at the Bank of England. Certainly, I think we're all thrilled that Mr. Goodhart has agreed to join us today. We also have a number of other individuals today, including a senior advisor to the Central Bank of Armenia, Robert Ford, who also had a great career with the OECD, and now he's been kind of advising us on key elements of framework development at the Central Bank of Armenia. We also have a board member from the Central Bank of Armenia, Mrs. Hasmi Kahramanyan, who actually began her career as kind of an economist within the Monetary Policy Department and now serves as a member of the board, and she'll be offering her contributions as well. And we also have with us today, it's good to see Jose Vicente Romero from the Central Bank of Colombia, as well as Asyakostanyan from the Better Policy Project, who together have done some really good work on transparency and credibility for central banks and monetary policy. So they'll be talking about that work as well. So without further ado, let's jump into the program, and I'll pass the floor to the governor now for his remarks. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Vi. It's wonderful to be back and see so many familiar faces. So it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to this final quarterly conference of 2013, hosted by the Central Bank of Armenia together with the Better Policy Project. The theme of conference today is designing state-of-the-art forecasting and policy analysis system to support monetary, fiscal, and macroprudential policies. In January, the Central Bank of Armenia will be launching formally FPAS Mark II, which is our new monetary policy making framework. The new framework is an evolution of the existing forecasting and policy analysis system designed to address what we believe to be the greatest policy imperative of our time, which is systematically dealing with unprecedentedly high risks and uncertainty. Our journey to develop FPAS Mark II formally began around 1 year ago when we issued our first working paper titled FPAS Mark II, Eliminating the Following Baseline and Local Approximations. At the time, the Central Bank of Armenia was in the midst of dealing with our third consecutive crisis in just 2 years. A reflection of this new geopolitical and macroeconomic environment which our country and our region was facing. So we, together with Doug Luxton, formerly at the IMF, and David Archer, the former Deputy Governor of Bank of New Zealand, thought, and it became clear to us that the old way of making monetary policy, what had been the gold standard of almost for 2 decades, was quickly losing its relevance and usefulness in the new environment that we were facing. So monetary policy frameworks were in need for fundamental reform from our perspective. We needed to critically rethink the essence of good monetary policy making processes and communications, and how our framework, institution, and people would need to be set up to serve this mission. The result of this year-long investment have been FPAS Mark II, as we call it. The new framework eliminates the emphasis on a baseline scenario, where the role of the central bank is perceived to be that of an expert forecaster. In its place, we institutionalize the idea of monetary policy as a risk management exercise. We highly rely on a structural set of illustrative scenarios that each embody a macroeconomically consistent narrative about latent risks and policy responses. So above all, FPAS Mark II is kind of a holistic framework, touching upon virtually every element of the policymaking and communication process. I would like to briefly walk through some of these aspects of the framework. First, from an institutional perspective, the implementation of FPAS Mark II is only possible if there is a broad investment in human capital development. At the CBA, we have invested heavily in developing our staff to be up to the highest standards internationally, and in transforming the CBA into a regional hub for economic research and analysis. Further, because this framework has been designed from ground up, this has also given us an opportunity to address issues like work-life balance, which is enabling us to have greater diversity and equity in our recruitment practices as well. Our hope is that this investment in human capital and institutional capacity development will also have broad downstream effects on society at large. Second, from an analytical perspective, FPAS Mark II recognizes the importance of having a best-in-class analytical toolkit. This includes a combination of nonlinear and linear models, which together can serve as one of the several helpful tools that well-trained economists and critical thinkers use to analyze the economy. At the same time, however, we emphasize the dangers of blind model dependency. Under FPAS Mark II, models are an important tool, but linear approximations can never serve as a substitute for sound economic thinking. Finally, FPAS Mark II explicitly prioritizes having the very high standards for transparency and accountability in our communication and our policies. This builds upon the foundation laid by the first generation of the FPAS and inflation targeting regimes, where transparency was identified as an important foundation for accountability that incentivize more effective and prudent policy making. FPAS Mark II strives to push the frontiers of transparency even further by centering our communication on risk and uncertainty. By explicitly acknowledging where there are key uncertainties, by communicating the relevant risks in a systematic way, and by reinforcing our commitment to acting prudently in the event that this risk materializes, this framework allows us to be more transparent and to boost our credibility. Of course, this approach is contingent on having a holistic communication framework that reaches all of the relevant stakeholders for the monetary policy and that follows the very best standards for written and oral communication. I'd like to conclude my remarks by reflecting on the importance of this work. Of course, robust frameworks like FPAS Mark II are a key cornerstone of good monetary policy making, which can contribute in very meaningful ways to price stability and macroeconomic stability in Armenia. This is an essential precondition for strong, sustainable, and long-term economic growth in Armenia that will improve the well-being of Armenian people. But beyond this, the development of the FPAS Mark II framework is a small but critical step in broader journey of institution building and state building in Armenia. We have our sight firmly set on establishing Armenia as a global thought leader for macroeconomics and monetary policy. By enhancing the institutional capacity of the Central Bank of Armenia, Our hope is that we can set new standards for institutional excellence in Armenia and spur like-minded reforms across the public and private sectors in the country. Most of all, investing in institutional building and state building in Armenia is arguably one of the most important foundations for having a thriving, secure, and viable state, particularly in this challenging time and challenging region that we're living. I think the staff of the Central Bank of Armenia for all of their I would like to thank the staff for all their hard work in making this reality, and my hope is that this will serve as an inspiration for the rest of the country and beyond. Thank you. So now I think I'll pass it over to Vahe Avakian, who has been managing the development of FPAS Mark II at the Central Bank of Armenia. Vahe will provide a bit more detail on key aspects of FPAS Mark II framework, which should set up the rest of our panel discussion quite nicely. After Vahe, we will turn the floor over to Charles Goodhart. I must say that it is a personal privilege of mine to share the stage with Charles, who has played a seminal role, whom we have been reading throughout our careers, and now we're having him with us. Thank you, Charles, for being with us today. And then we will turn to, we will hear from Asya and Jose Vicente Romero, who will share some of their work on transparency, accountability, and credibility of monetary policy, which is an especially important topic for us. And then we will transition to an open discussion with the presenters of our panelists, who would include CBA board member Hasmik Gharamanyan, Bob Ford, who is former deputy director of OECD and served as a senior advisor to the CBA. Thank you very much, Bob, as well. And Michel Julliard from Banque de France, who has played a pioneering role in development of open source modeling software as Diner and Julia. So I'd like to thank you all for participation and very much looking forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. I'll now begin my presentation. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. I hope you can all see my screen. So as the governor mentioned, I wanted to briefly just kind of set up the rest of the panel discussion by talking about some of the key elements of the Mark II framework, just so that we all are on the same page in terms of our knowledge of the framework and what we're able to discuss. So within about 10 minutes or so at a maximum, I hope I'll be able to run through the key elements of this framework. But as the governor mentioned, the FPAS Mark II framework was really born from this need to fundamentally rethink what the purpose of monetary policy is, and in particular, how the framework that we use to make monetary policy ought to be set up. This is, of course, inspired by a series of kind of crises that we, of course, faced at the Central Bank of Armenia, beginning with COVID, to the war of aggression launched by Azerbaijan, to the kind of the broader geopolitical crises in our region, which kind of made us very quickly realize that kind of a fundamental truth that we've always known, which is that good monetary policymaking is really, in essence, a risk management exercise. And how is it that we actually conduct monetary policy? I think we ought to set up our framework in a way that actually reflects how good monetary policy making is made, and thus set up the framework in a way that supports that. So monetary policy making is made by first kind of sitting down and very soberly analyzing key risks and issues that are facing your economy at any given point in time. That requires understanding where the economy is today, what the driving forces are, and where the kind of key uncertainties lie. These are kind of the essential ingredients of FPAS analysis, right? Then the job of the policymakers is really to do whatever is necessary with our policy instruments to bring inflation back to the target and stabilize the economy. But most importantly, I think the essence of good policymaking is also avoiding slides into dark corners and dangerous nonlinearities. These in particular are the areas where policymaking errors can lead to the gravest kind of welfare outcomes for a given population, for a given country, and they can be quite catastrophic. We've seen kind of glimpses of this in recent years, even in advanced economies, where policy errors or kind of issues with how the economy was being analyzed and communicated was creating kind of unnecessary challenges and perhaps making situations more difficult than they needed to be. For developing countries like Armenia and certainly other kind of emerging market economies, these kind of policy errors, the types that are entirely avoidable, should be things that, you know, a framework should help us certainly avoid. And so this kind of formulation of the purpose of monetary policy really aligns with this principle of monetary policy as risk management. The same idea that, of course, has been spoken about for many years. This has been, of course, kind of talked about a lot by Alan Greenspan several times. This is also an idea that in many ways kind of we see attempts at kind of putting this into practice at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand when we hear Adrian Orr talking about things like a policy of least regrets. And so the idea for FPAS Mark II is to really institutionalize this framework of monetary policy as risk management. So when we think about what are the issues with our existing frameworks, right? As the governor mentioned, you know, FPAS Mark I is really kind of the gold standard for monetary policy making for several decades. But there's a few places where these frameworks have kind of fundamental issues, and they become particularly problematic, I think, in the new kind of economic reality and geopolitical reality that we're living in. Some of these issues are one that we find that under the Mark I approach, again, Mark I being our terminology for the original kind of iteration of the forecasting and policy analysis system, how flexible inflation targeting is typically practiced at most kind of the best in class central banks. What we find to be the issue there, first of all, is that there's a lot of emphasis on linear models and using kind of model says or Kalman filter says as kind of a substitute for good economic thinking. And in particular, we find that this kind of over-reliance on these linear models it can also be problematic in the sense that insufficient attention is paid to some dangerous nonlinearities. Of course, the nonlinearities, like I mentioned, that's something that we need to be paying close attention to as policymakers to avoid these kind of dark corners, to avoid these kind of very worst case policy outcomes that are entirely avoidable. The second kind of issue is that we think the way that the framework tends to be set up and the way that policy tends to be communicated actually tends to hide a lot of the richness of policy deliberations. We find a lot of policy deliberations in terms of how they're structured or structured around risk assessments, talking about where the uncertainty is, that kind of process that I outlined on the prior slide. And the way the frameworks are set up, where the emphasis is a lot on the baseline scenario and using a baseline scenario to communicate policy, that really kind of masks a lot of that fundamental richness that guides how policymaking is made. And so in our perspective, I think true transparency in our communications needs to really reflect that process through which policy is actually made. In thinking about the baseline scenario, in addition to kind of that flaw that I just mentioned, one of the other issues with the baseline scenario is that it tends to kind of limit our policy agility quite significantly. This, I think, becomes particularly problematic in times when we're dealing with significant and sometimes very kind of fundamental uncertainty about current economic developments or even things kind of outside of the typical purview of monetary policy, but that could certainly kind of impact us at any given moment. And this we see this kind of again very often in kind of our corner of the world, but you see this a lot in kind of advanced economies as well. If one kind of turns back the page a couple of years and thinks about how advanced economy central banks were talking about the kind of early stages of the COVID era inflation, we see that kind of relying on a single baseline to communicate the interpretation of what's driving inflation in the economy, as well as where it's likely to be headed, created kind of this communications trap for policymakers, where it became significantly more costly to later kind of reverse course. And when it became clear that that the initial interpretation of what was driving high inflation wasn't actually holding to be true. So this other idea that I wanted to mention is this sense that one of the problems that we find with the baseline scenario is also that it tends to kind of put the central bank in this role of where we're perceived as being an expert forecaster. I think those are the words that the governor used. And this can be problematic because when we think about scenarios are intended to be kind of a very useful communications vehicle. They're an important part of kind of good kind of forward guidance, which includes, of course, a quantitative component, but also kind of a qualitative narrative-driven component as well. But a lot of that nuance can be lost when we rely on the baseline as our central communications vehicle, because the central bank is then perceived as kind of an expert forecaster rather than a risk manager or even a policymaker. Also, the issue is that we find the baseline scenario can tend to become the dominant view in the market, and it crowds out alternative views in the market, which can be particularly problematic, again, in the event that that kind of baseline interpretation of the world proves to be flawed. So what's our proposal under FPAS Mark II? Rather than having a single baseline scenario and really emphasizing or kind of putting all of our efforts into trying to kind of forecast the future with the greatest degree of accuracy possible, we instead rely on this kind of structured and systematic set of case scenarios that are intended to serve as illustrative examples of policy responses to relevant risks and uncertainties. These are intended to be kind of macro consistent scenarios that are illustrative in nature, in the sense that we say with 100% certainty that this scenario, won't play out, but there's a certain set of kind of upside or downside risks and uncertainties that are embodied in those scenarios, and in the event that they unfold, they can serve as kind of an illustrative communications device for us to kind of communicate our likely policy response in the events that those types of risks materialize. So the way that they're structured, we call them case A and case B. Now we structure these scenarios relative to market expectations of the future path of the policy rate. So in the case A scenario, this is when we have hotter economic conditions that would require a higher path of the future policy rate than what the market's currently pricing in. And the case B is kind of the flip side of that, where there's cooler economic conditions and a policy rate path lower than market expectations. And this is important because it's kind of having this illustrative approach to scenarios as opposed to kind of a more expert forecaster approach to scenarios allows us to really have a more narrative-based discussion of the policy relevant issues. And it removes a lot of these self-imposed restrictions on policy agility, particularly when we're faced with a lot of these kind of fundamental issues that are always there when we're making monetary policy. In terms of how our policymaking cycle is structured, we've structured in such a way that, again, it's intended to have a lot of kind of dynamism and encourage board members to kind of be really centering these key questions of risk and uncertainty and their relevance to monetary policy when they're going through the policymaking round. So we start off with a kickoff meeting where board members are talking about and having kind of an open discussion about their major concerns and tail risks. We give them opportunities and emphasize their individual accountability to actually draft out what they believe are the most policy relevant risks at any given point in time. And we structure kind of our overall communications in such a way where this kind of organic process of policymaking, this very dynamic process, is actually what's communicated rather than a single baseline scenario where we try to cram in maybe potentially contradictory points of view. And this is the kind of final point that I'll make, which is that when we set up the process in this way, the idea is really to enhance the decision-making process and make it a lot more dynamic. So getting rid of this need to achieve consensus around a single baseline or worldview, and instead kind of leveraging the brain power of individual board members, emphasizing their individual contributions, and also ensuring that we're creating opportunities to have board members kind of be able to contribute their own kind of alternative viewpoints, a lot of times which may deviate meaningfully from a so-called kind of consensus view, but which may kind of incorporate a lot of important points of view that need to be taken into account in the round itself. This is actually, I promise, the final note that I'll make, which is that the kind of the success of the framework, in addition to kind of the human capital components that the governor mentioned and that we talked about extensively in our morning session today, the success of the framework really rests on, we believe, a comprehensive communications and transparency framework. So from a communications point of view, right, we think about the importance of being able to reach all of our key stakeholders and using a variety of kind of key kind of communications vehicles to reach those different groups. This, of course, includes having kind of the very highest standards for a monetary policy report, the very highest standards for press conferences, as well as technical briefings with analysts, as well as maintaining very, very high levels of kind of transparency in terms of our data releases and our model documentation, things like that, but also taking the opportunity to engage in kind of society-wide economic literacy initiatives And again, this idea of there being a lot of kind of externalities or benefits from the work that we're doing here and using those as opportunities to improve economic literacy among society, we think is only beneficial in the long term. And of course, Asya and Jose, at the end of this panel, we'll talk about kind of the importance of transparency and kind of put this into some greater context. So I'll pause here and I'll turn the floor over now to Charles Goodhart, and we look forward to hearing your contributions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm not involved with the wider issues of your framework, which are several, but I'm very much in line with you on the disadvantages of what you describe as the baseline forecast, I describe as a single peak forecast. There are many reasons for this. The first is no one actually knows or can know the future. Not only are our models limited, but the world changes and unforeseen shocks happen from time to time. So one of the problems with a baseline or single peak forecast is it implies much more certainty about what is going to happen than anyone, including particularly the forecasters, actually believe. I have attended many forecasting processes over the last 50 or 60 years, and virtually every single forecast occasion that I've attended, the forecasters have started by saying the current situation is uniquely uncertain. It is always uncertain, maybe a little bit more or a little bit less, but it is always totally uncertain. And having a single peak modal baseline forecast gives an entirely invalid approach to that. Now, Mervyn King actually tried a way of trying to explain some of the difficulties by having a fan chart with a wide range, which varied depending on how uncertain you thought the situation was, and the potentiality for a skew. I'm afraid to say that although I think Mervyn had his heart in the right place, it was a gallant failure. To give one example, when Mervyn left and Mark Carney took over, the fan chart fell into disuse in the UK. During the period when Mark Carney was governor, the range spread of the fan chart was held constant and the skew was always absolutely zero. So it played no part whatsoever. And no one takes very much notice of it. The present chief forecaster of the Bank of England, Hugh Pill, has introduced a skew in recent quarters when the upside risks were much greater than the downside risks, compared with the modal point. But nobody much took any notice of it. There are a whole series of other reasons why I think even with a sort of fan chart skew approach, which has been, I think, a failure, it doesn't really work. The first one is that risks are not simple pairs. You can't, with risks, you can't say that there's a sort of modal outcome. At the next American election, assuming the candidates are now Trump and Biden, you've got the possibility that Trump might become president again or Biden might become president again. You can't get a sort of single forecast by combining a 50% chance of Trump and a 50% chance of Biden. It doesn't really make any sense. So, and many risks are not of the form where you can sort of combine them in any real sense into a single peak forecast. Moreover, the having a single peak baseline forecast puts great emphasis on the deviations of the outcome from the forecasts, rather than the analysis of how the risks have changed in order to drive the forecast, the single peak forecast, out of line. What we're going to have or need to have then is scenarios depending on the perceived risks. One thing that you may not have noted, I didn't see it in any of your discussions, is that when you do these scenarios, you need to have them even numbered, because the Fed and others have frequently, the Fed staff frequently provided to the FOMC three forecasts, an optimistic, a middle, and a pessimistic. And inevitably, everybody chooses the middle, and that brings you right back to the single peak forecast. If you have the risk scenarios in even numbers, either X or Y, then there is much less chance of people trying to get back to a single forecast. And if the central bank is sensible and does not give a numerical probability distribution to one risk or the other occurring, it means that everybody, including politicians and journalists, will have to think. Whereas if you actually try to give them numerical probabilities, you will get back almost immediately to the single peak forecast. The problem is that politicians and journalists do not like to think. And the baseline forecast is about as easy to assimilate as anything could be. And if you go into a scenario approach, it means that the politicians and the journalists actually have to think for themselves what the probability of these different risk scenarios might be, and therefore where we might be going. And they may not like that. And one of the concerns that I actually have about your approach is, having done your risk scenarios, what do you then do if the head of government turns around to you and says, well, that's all very fine, but I'd actually like your best estimate, single estimate, of where you think things are going, because it makes it much easier for me. The other advantage which your risk scenario has, which I didn't actually see mentioned again, is that you're focusing on monetary policy. But a central bank nowadays has at least two aspects of its work. It's got to be concerned not only with inflation and monetary policy in the macroeconomic sense, it's also got to be concerned with financial stability. Now, financial stability issues depend entirely on risk scenarios, non-linearities, extreme events of the kind that you mentioned. And if we drive monetary policy into a risk scenario approach, that will tie the monetary policy aspect of the central bank's activity much more closely in with the financial stability aspect of the central bank's what they have to do. And at the moment, a monetary policy committee and a financial stability committee, as we have in the UK, are really rather separate. They look at things in a separate way. They are really rather different kinds of animals, which in some senses I think is a pity. If we appreciate that the key for both monetary policy and financial stability is assessment of what are the likely risks that may play out, the two will be brought back much more closely into a much more harmonious union. And that, I think, would be a great advantage. So for all these reasons, I think that the approach of risk scenarios that you are suggesting for monetary policy is absolutely right. But I must warn you that it makes it much, much more difficult for your readers, the journalists, the politicians, to easily assimilate. And they may turn around and say, well, this is all very fine, but I want something simpler. I just want the basic baseline single peak forecast. What do you do then? Now, that's a question that I don't know the answer to, and I should be interested in how you would deal with such a response. I think that's enough for me, but if there are any questions, I'd be very glad to answer them. So I got two messages for you. When you're dealing with risk scenarios, don't do in 3 or 5, do in 2 or 4. And the other question is, what do you do if the risk scenario approach is just too difficult for your audience to assimilate?
Doug, I believe you're speaking, but on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So you've raised very good points. Let me talk about what I think are the simplest ones. Okay, which do they always come in pairs? And I would say generally yes. Okay, for the reasons that you referred to. But there can be, so we are very specific about these things. Like we call case A, like a scenario where interest rates have to rise, say, modestly higher than what's currently priced in financial markets. Okay, we've been doing this for well over a year now, and publishing. The students have been publishing it in this thing called Not the Teal Book. Okay, so just before each FOMC meeting, we publish like a case A and a case B scenario. Okay, and so the terminal rates have in the case A have been around 6, and in the case B scenario they've been around 4, and that's been kind of fun because when you actually looked at interest rates, the interest rate curve, it kind of just moved back and forth between A and B, and the issues have been very common. Every day, it's always been. It looks like there's more steam in the U.S. economy, and the inflationary forces are more persistent. Or B, there's some risk of recession and some financial fragility. So it's worked wonderfully in that case. But we also have one, Charles, that's based on the summer of 2021. Okay, and there we use a case X as well. Okay, and it's just to make it's basically just to make a separate point. So we think of these charts as being a frame of reference from which the policymakers can explain what their positions are better. Okay, and so back in the summer of 2021, we recommended that not only do you want to have a case A and case B, so case A is that it's not transitory, case B is that it's transitory. But then the question becomes, what about case X? Okay, what if we were to get hit with some bad luck? Okay, given that we have a model with endogenous credibility that says that if we get hit with some stagflationary shocks, we might lose credibility faster. Okay, and so to show a commitment that you're prepared to raise interest rates if it turns out not to look transitory, or if it looks even more challenging, that it's starting to result in a wage price spiral. So sometimes, okay, when we talk about like the way you're thinking about case A and case B, that somehow they split the difference, there might be a situation, okay, when you're trying to make a separate point, okay, and using it as a prop, okay, where it could come in handy. The other thing is that at the very beginning of the document, there is a risk assessment table, like a taxonomy, where we break it into stagflationary shocks and kind of the opposite of stagflationary shocks, as well as excess demand and excess supply shocks, right? So in the quadrant where we have the stagflationary shocks, that's where it gets difficult because we have to manage the short run output inflation trade-off and stuff. And so we do. So I buy your point that if the only thing you did was like A, B, and C, that'd be problematic. But I think if you're just using it as a prop to tell a story and say very clearly that, good forward guidance is a combination of quantitative forward guidance, in other words, my A and my B scenario, and qualitative forward guidance, the policymakers having a wonderful, rich framework to be able to express what their views are. Are they more aligned with a case A kind of scenario? And so on. Okay. Your second point. Yeah.
What the financial market will do is it will take your scenarios and will ask you what probability you apply to each of the scenarios. And then you get back very quickly to a sort of single forecast. And one of the things that I think that you have to do is you have to be very cautious and say, actually, a risk is a risk. We don't know what the probability, we can't give a numerical number to the probability of that outcome because we just don't know. And what's more, not only don't we know, nobody can know.
Yeah, that's very much consistent with how we're trying to communicate everything. Okay.
Yeah.
I would say exactly, but we still face the problem of it's still difficult to communicate uncertainty. Okay, and we're giving up the baseline, and that's our we'll see. I think they'll get used to it. That's what I think the answer is, that they'll get used to it.
With luck. I very much hope you're right, because what you're doing is correct. The difficulty is not that it is correct. The problem is getting people to do it.
Yeah. Okay, good. Did anybody else have any comments or thoughts? Bob? Yeah, or...
So, Charles, just to give you a sense, the biggest problem that we're currently having is not the Prime Minister or the government. The biggest problem is the IMF, who is trying to put us in a world of one baseline scenario where they get the number they want from us, and they can build their spreadsheets built on what we have done so far. We're trying to resist, but it's extremely difficult because they are solely concentrated on this one baseline, which gives the exact numbers, and no matter how wrong the numbers are. So they are not interested in narratives or the way we think, but they are interested in one baseline, which can give them ability to fill in the spreadsheets. So
indeed, I'm absolutely right. It just makes life for the users of central bank policy. It just makes life for those politicians, journalists, IMF, World Bank. It just makes their life more difficult. And they're going to sort of kick back at having their life made more difficult. I very much hope that you are right, that your system will be adopted, because it is the right system, but it's a more complicated system. It makes people think. People don't like thinking.
No, I agree. It's like Harry Truman stuff, one-handed economist story. But we'll try. We'll see.
Esme, please.
Okay, thank you. It's great pleasure to be here on the same stage. I have a question to Charles Coulthard. You mentioned about politicians, journalists, maybe government or not. Martin mentioned about the IMF. What about the financial markets, the financial market participants?
I think it was Robert, I can't remember who said, that one of the problems of the present baseline single peak forecast is that it focuses the financial market on single values, which single values are almost certainly not going to arrive. But the financial market finds it much easier to deal with a simple, even if erroneous, construct than the more complicated construct of risk scenarios where nobody actually knows exactly what the probability of each risk is. You are addressing the underlying true complexity of the world as it is. And neither financial markets, nor journalists, nor politicians, nor the IMF like being faced with complexity and having to think for themselves.
Okay, thank you.
That's a bit depressing, Charles. But I mean,
I at least feel that what you are doing is absolutely right. And you just have to, it's a problem of communication as much as anything else. You have to persuade other people that although it's difficult, more difficult than a single erroneous forecast, it's a better way of doing things. And I would also advise you to note that it does tie together the way that a central bank would think of monetary policy and of financial stability issues at the same time. Yeah. And I think that's one of the great virtues of what you're doing.
Yeah, and I see that from my perspective. Yeah,
I agree with all this sort of stuff. I'd express it slightly differently, though, as I see it. On decision day, when the central bank announces its policy, people want to know, and I think this is perfectly legitimate. They want to know why you made that particular decision, as distinct from some other decision, right? And I think you should tell them somehow why you made that decision. And what they do normally is they take the baseline, and for better or worse, they believe that baseline expresses why you made that decision, right? I mean, that would be the purpose of producing a base or publishing a baseline at all. It's not some sort of abstract concept about things. It is supposed to incorporate, at best, it's supposed to incorporate why the central bank decided to do what they did today. Now it probably doesn't do that. And you could argue that one reason for not doing a baseline is because no baseline can express that point. And for financial markets or the prime minister or anybody else to take the baseline that way is probably not a good idea. On the other hand, you're going to have to fulfill that demand, I think, the demand to know why you did what you did. The alternative scenarios aren't going to do it. They are scenarios that, by assumption, are not going to happen. That's why they're alternative scenarios, right? Or with a small risk, they're going to happen. So this is going to put the bottom line for me is that getting rid of the baseline is going to put a great deal of pressure on how you describe why you did what you did in some verbal sense, because that's all they're going to have to go on. If you don't do that, they're going to make it up. They're either going to split the difference between your A and B thing somehow and say that's what you must think, or they'll just speculate about why you did it. It's a bit untransparent not to produce a baseline in that sense, right? It might be the right thing to do, but it's a bit untransparent, and you're gonna have to fill that void. In fact, for me, the whole point of your publication on that day is going to be essentially to fill that void. And it's I think it's going to be hard to do. I wish you luck.
Okay, I think it. Let's see.
We'll see.
Let's see. When I think back at how far we've come, if we go back 30, 40 years, transparency was almost zero. Okay, and people were very, reluctant to increase transparency, fearing that we didn't really know what we were doing. So this problem, while I agree, people are going to be asking for it. I don't think it's going to be insurmountable, and I think as long as it's explained, particularly with a board, okay, because you can always say that part of the board wanted higher rates and part of the board wanted lower rates. So the actual justification for the policy action, I think, is easier. I think it's easier when you do it this way. But
really,
let's.
There's a problem with that. If
Yes.
you take the ECB, for example, they have
Yes.
the belief that the policy will have much more impact if it is regarded as unanimous. And they also have a concern, since it's a collection of separate states, that if there is notification of differences, people will say, well, the Germans wanted something, but the Southern Europeans wanted something else. And they're worried about that. And the Bank of England is about the only central bank which actually encourages individuals who not only if they want to take a different position, but to explain why they're doing it. And again, in the US, there's you have to be fairly strong-minded to go against the chair, particularly when it was someone like Alan Greenspan.
Yeah, for the big advanced economies, okay, but we just like, and maybe this is a good time to shift to Asia and Jose, but for the smaller countries, okay, where I think they've made much more progress developing these regimes, okay, like, but for the advanced economies, they're very much late to this FPAS game, okay, but maybe Asia can talk a little bit about what FPAS central banks are, and then maybe we can talk about some of those experiences. Like you talk about ECB, the Fed, Bank of Japan, Bank of England, they're all way behind the development of monetary frameworks that started off in New Zealand, in the 1990s and spread to a bunch of central
End of
banks
the
where they go.
1980s, I was an advisor to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand as inflation targetry was introduced. It was
in 89.
89.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry. Okay, yeah.
Go on.
Okay, that's it. That's all I was just yes. Okay, so let's look at some of their experiences. Okay, Azia, maybe you could or whoever's doing it, Jose.
Yeah, I think I will start. So it's a pleasure to be here and present our work to you. I'm gonna talk about central bank transparency. We have been working on this subject 5 years already. So Jose is also here. He's from the Central Bank of Colombia, and he has also been working with us on this subject. And we wrote together this working paper last year in 2022. But before that, we also published a few working papers. The first one was an IMF working paper, and that was the foundation of this new index that we created for assessing central bank transparency. This work has been done for inflation targeting central banks, and so a big emphasis here is put on the FPAS framework. So whether the central bank has and communicates properly their forecasting and policy analysis system or not. So back then we didn't introduce the concept of FPAS Mark II yet. And in this latest paper in 2022, we were assessing the transparency of FPAS Mark I central banks, so the usual FPAS central banks, but we are starting to build the framework for assessing already the transparency of the new framework. So basically, we're building the transition between the FPAS Mark I and FPAS Mark II framework. But still, there are a few central banks that are not FPAS, that's how we call them. So basically, they don't have the forecasting and policy analysis system, and in the terms of transparency, they don't communicate it as well. So I will elaborate later what we mean in particular when we say FPAS. Just to continue here, first we implemented this index on the Czech National Bank, working with the staff from the Czech National Bank, including the board members, such as Thomas Holub, who is also our co-author. So after writing the paper, the Czech National Bank continued investing in their transparency and improved based on the gaps that we identified together. And then we applied the index on the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, again working with people who work there, as well as the Central Bank of Chile. And finally, with Jose, we also implemented the index on Central Bank of Colombia, as well as a few other central banks. And let me briefly introduce what is the innovation of the new index, because most of us are familiar with the Stinser-Eichengreen Central Bank Transparency Index, which has been around for many years already, and it has been updated also last year. The main difference is that we focus on only on inflation targeting central banks, whether they at the same time they're focusing on all the central banks. So they have 150 central banks in their sample. Besides, we also include the transparency aspects of financial stability, because now more and more central banks have financial stability mandates. As well as I already mentioned, a key thing here is about the central bank's FPAS framework, whether how well are they communicating it. So our index has three components. First component is about the transparency of central bank objectives. Second one is the biggest one, and that's all about the FPAS. And the latest one is about the policy process communication. So what we mean when we say FPAS? So forecasting and policy analysis system. Vahe already talked about this, and here we need to keep in mind these three questions that the monetary policy or any it can be also macroprudential or fiscal, any policy framework needs to give answers to these three essential questions. First one, where is the economy now? What are the underlying forces, and how the policy adjusts its instruments to achieve policy objectives? So, and this last point is the one that differentiates the FPAS central banks from non-FPAS central banks. So in the first section, or the section on monetary policy objectives, we look into the central banks, how clearly they communicate their objectives, how well is their inflation target defined, and whether their financial stability objectives override inflation or price stability objectives or not. So here, maximum is 4 points. Next, we have the biggest section, which is on the FPAS. So here we look into the central bank's policy system, and we evaluate whether they communicate all the data and forecast that has been used during the projection round, and as well as the projection models with their documentations and codes and so on. Because this one was designed for the FPAS Mark 1 central banks, we here also talk about alternative scenarios, risk management scenarios. So in that framework, we still have the central banks who usually have baseline scenario, and sometimes or regular alternative scenarios or risk assessment scenarios. And finally, we have the section on policy process, where we look into the communication of the board's decision. So whether there is a press release or whether there is a conference meeting with analysts, and are the minutes published, and how are they attributed or not? And finally, does the central bank invite external evaluation of the policy framework? And we have the results here. These are from the paper, from 2022 paper, and the evaluation was done for the year 2021 for all the central banks except for India and Mongolia, because we worked with them recently with the staff from the central bank, and their scores are for 2022. The central banks that are marked in red, they are non-FPAS central banks. So meaning that they have either constant interest rate assumptions or exogenous interest rate assumptions, like the UK or the ECB or Australia or South Korea. So what this chart tells us is that the central banks who invested through the years into building the forecasting and policy analysis systems tend to be more transparent than the ones who are not. And obviously the orange part of these charts, which is the part on the section B, the FPAS section, is the smallest for the non-FPAS central banks. And just to illustrate the differences here, the second most transparent central bank is the Czech National Bank, which is one of the best examples of an FPAS central bank that publishes their interest rate forecast, which is endogenous, and all the other forecasts are based on that. So there are lots of great stories about how does the Czech National Bank's forecasting and policy analysis system has been efficient through the years, and even when they were doing the unconventional policies and so on. And we compare, in our paper, we compare the Czech National Bank with the Bank of England. So here are the charts from the May 22 report, where we can see that the Bank of England does not communicate any policy path projection that is based on endogenous interest rates. Instead, it's they were communicating two. These are the projections of CPI. The first one is based on the market interest rate expectations, while the other is based on the constant 1% interest rate assumption, and in both cases the inflation goes back to the target, even though again the interest rate is not endogenous. So this is basically my part. Jose will continue, and at the same time, if you have any questions, please.
Are you going to talk about how you're starting to use ChatGPT? Okay, like how you can train ChatGPT, and then after you train ChatGPT, you can use it to analyze monetary policy reports for. Are you going to be talking about that today, Asya? But anyway, that would be fun.
Yeah, so actually we did that exercise where we ChatGPT is an AI, so we told it what is the FPAS and what is non-FPAS, and then we introduced the introductions from Reserve Bank of New Zealand and Bank of England's monetary policy reports, and then it gave us some comparison, and the result was that Bank of England's report is not as well structured. It is more narrative based than the one of Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and the one in Reserve Bank of New Zealand focuses more on connects more the economic narrative to the policy decision compared to the Bank of England. So it is very interesting, the output, because that was exactly what we would expect, and that's what the ChatGPT gave us based on the information that we provided it.
Jose, are you ready, please?
Yes, perfect. Well, thank you very much for having me here. I just want to add a couple of additional things to what Asya said. The first one is like, well, transparency is a foundation for central bank accountability, but also I want to mention that it's an import that also helps monetary policy, the conducting of monetary policy. And in this sense, I want to show you a little bit of the experience of Colombia. Like we have had inflation, forecasting inflation targeting for a while, but in 2019 there was an important change in the mindset of how we wanted to do things, and we just re-engineer all the process of the forecasting, the forecasting process, the FPAS system here in Colombia. As all changes, it is difficult. Like at the beginning, it demands more time. It demands additional effort from the people that is involved in the production of the forecast and the production of the reports. And there was an additional feature that makes things a little bit harder, because we made all these changes trying to move to an FPAS Mark 1 at the end of 2019. We have worked during all 2019, and then in 2020 we have the COVID shock. So it was really challenging during the COVID shock, for example, to be more transparent on your forecasts, on your risk scenarios, or how we were dealing with uncertainty. But as you may see, using the index of central bank with inflation target credibility, we improve our metrics. I just want to show you a little comparison between Chile and Colombia. Chile is one of the leading central bank in transparency, and because it's from the region, how they look when we compare with Colombia. And as you may see in section B, is the one that we have a gap yet in transparency metrics. There's two additional things that I just want to mention, like really quickly. Is the first one is that transparency is important for accountability, and FPAS Mark 1 or Mark 2 is important when you try to democratize information. You need these frameworks in order to try to make information accessible to the public. You cannot start doing TikToks or Twitters or whatever strategy you want to have in your social media platforms if you don't have like a clear framework to communicate. But besides the accountability, there's tangible evidence that shows that transparency helps to build credibility. And for example, this recent study by two of the directors of the board of the Central Bank of Colombia, using a large meta-analysis, they found that transparency, in this case, they use the transparency index that has a really important impact on monetary policy and activities that are made by the central banks. They found that central bank transparency increased policy effectiveness by 69% when dealing with foreign exchange intervention, by 59% when dealing with capital inflows, and 14% when dealing with conventional monetary policy. And the other thing that what I think is that makes transparency more important is that it builds credibility, and when it helps to it helps to build credibility that also helps the conductor of monetary policy with shocks that we expect that in the future are going to be more complicated. For example, those related with climate-related shocks or with climate change. Just to make that point, this is a simulation that we have with a model that includes a credibility. And in the case of Colombia, we are affected by El Nino southern oscillation fluctuations. Like a lot of countries in the Americas, and actually this has impacts over several countries. But in the case of Latin America, they can be really strong. In the case of Colombia, when we have El Nino, what it happens is that we have severe droughts, which affect foodstuff prices and electricity prices as well. So what we have in this simulation is that, or the kind of effect scenarios that you can build and you can think in this world that this kind of shocks may be arising more frequently, is that the simulation that we have there is that if you are with a central bank that is highly credible versus in a point where you have a lower credibility. And if in this kind of shocks, in the case of Colombia and for the simulations that I'm showing you there, the El Nino shocks, they were like a nasty supply shock that increases food inflation, increases inflation, has a limited impact on overall GDP. But also we find that they may have impact on inflation expectations. And if you have lower credibility levels, the impact that you may have on prices, on inflation expectations are going to be higher than if you have a high credibility. So that is just to make this point that besides transparency helps to build credibility and has tangible impacts also in the future, like having like these kind of shocks that may be becoming more frequent. These kind of frameworks will be helpful to communicate to the public. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we can now open it up to questions and comments from the panel. Maybe Hazmek. Hazmek's a board member at the Central Bank of Armenia, and maybe Bob. Maybe you could go next, Bob.
Thank you, Doug. Less than a couple of months ago, I read an article by Charles Goodhart in the Center of Economic Research Publications. And the article was about whether the central bank should abandon single point forecasts. And I shared it immediately with my colleagues. And it was a kind of verification that we are doing something the state of art currently. So I think that it's a very important milestone for effective policy. Currently, although it has a lot of challenges, I think, and the main challenges are regard to communication. And we had very good sessions with Doug's colleagues from Bank of Canada. Lawrence Chambry, he shared his thoughts with us, how to communicate to be more understandable, how to share thoughts, how to prove that the scenarios are plausible, relevant, and probable for public, for financial institutions, for maybe journalists or politicians, not to create more uncertainty. So I think, Charles Coulthard told today once more that it creates some uncertainty for them. They want a single figure, and currently it's impossible to share single figure. I think we have a lot of challenges regarding communication. And we have to explain our framework and advantages of that framework. The other topic that's very interesting that Charles Coulthard told today about is that the scenario building, this risk management approach, ties two mandates together more closely. And I think that we have to rethink about that. Because although we are, as a board members, making decision on monetary policy and financial stability, changing buffers and so on, and we see the same environment of developments, although we have to rethink to tie this implementation of two mandates together. I think, I still think that the financial system, the participants of financial market will still demand from us some certainty, and it will be very difficult to convince them that we can't share only one scenario, because sharing one scenario and telling them that we are doing, for example, this or that with our interest rates, and as the environment is changing very drastically, when another event occurs, we will lose our credibility. So we have to communicate with them very detailed, and we have the governor said that we had a broad investment in our human capital, and I think we still need this investment in human capital, and not only recruiting employees and so on, also creating content for sharing with the stakeholders of information that we are publishing. So my colleagues told a lot about the FPAS Mark II framework. I just don't have to add anything, but I just want to mention one thing from the point of view of employees, which in our case is the forecasting team, which provides the now, I don't know, Doug, whether they will continue to be called forecasting team. Maybe they will be called scenario building team or so, or environment analyst and so on. When they were presenting the developments of the economy, and they were presenting us the most probable scenario, the baseline scenario, and the board sometimes had an information asymmetry, maybe another mode of thinking and so on, and didn't accept the suggestion of the team who was providing the forecast. When I was in the team, I was disappointed for myself because I couldn't convince the board to take the suggestion, to buy the suggestion and to change or not change the interest rate. So I was disappointed for myself, but now I understand that it will be a good opportunity for the team to analyze from different aspects, present a wide range of risks, and board members will make their input there and decide which one is the possible, probable, and relevant scenario. So what I wanted to say is that we still will face this challenge of communication, and we have a lot to do for creating content. That is what I wanted to share.
Thanks.
And I liked Charles Goodhart's comment about the fun chart, what Mervyn King told, was communicating with fun chart, and when McCartney became a governor of the Bank of England, the skewness and the uncertainty of fun chart were remaining stable, and it was another challenge for financial markets. So nothing, no messages. So it's very good reason to think by scenarios and drop this baseline, balanced risks, and so on and so on. Thank you.
Charles, I have a question for you that's sort of related to what Asmik was saying and in response to what you said, because you seem to be agreeing with us that baselines just don't make any sense. Okay, and from my perspective, as someone that tried to teach people frameworks based on Mark 1, there was always this fuzzy part. Okay, like in other words, you do all the analytical work and then you just go, okay, and now it's this. Somebody would be making that decision about what the number is, and it would not be consistent with all the let's say the underlying theory that the number was supposed to be based on when we call it the most likely single peak scenario. You pointed out some other ones. How can it be data dependent? It should be moving around every second conceptually, and if it's not, that's a big problem. Central banks that do push the baseline scenario, it takes time to do that, to impose macroeconomic consistency. What if something happens just an hour before they're about to release the forecast? It just can't. So there's folly in the baseline, and there's also folly in producing it then, because it means that people have to kind of agree to something that's nonsense. In my experience, that can burn significant resources investing in folly. But I'm just wondering, Charles, in your experience, this whole emphasis on this baseline, how much time do you think it's wasted you, or wasted all the time in discussions using it when in some sense it's just fundamentally wrong?
No, I agree with you, but I think the problem is to get people to adopt the more complicated mechanism that you rightly want to achieve. There was one thing that you said that I should have said, and that I would emphasize. Currently, what the central banks are saying is that they are data dependent. Now, what I think that means is that as things change, and they always will, they're going to sort of not stick with a particular model forecast, but they're going to change the forecast, as you say, as things change all the time. And that means you've got to think ahead what might change and what the risks might be. And one, I think, can ask, when is it right for a central bank not to be data dependent? And if central banks agree that they have to be data dependent, It means they have to be prepared to change their forecasts really quite dramatically as risks change. And if you're going to do that, you want to have some forward warning of what might actually that would be involved in changing your forecast. I think that the fact that central banks are now talking about their forecasts being data dependent is an opening that you could exploit.
Okay, Bob, did you have any questions or comments?
Not too much more than what I said before. I mean, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to things like central scenarios and stuff than you guys are. I recognize it's true they're not going to happen. But that's going to be true of your risk scenarios too. They're not going to happen either, for the same reasons the central scenario is not going to happen. So you could make the same argument for them if you wanted. I don't want to make that argument because I think having alternative scenarios is a good idea. Again, I go back to the issue of, I don't think I've never interpreted a central scenario as something that's going to happen, because I know it's not. Or a forecast as something that's going to happen, because I know it's not. What I interpret it as is capturing somehow the view of the policymakers, or at least on which they base their policy. Or alternatively, at least a reasonable input into that view, a slightly weaker thing, right? That this is sort of how they vaguely see the world, and they've used that as information on which to base a policy. That in turn, that interpretation, it's not that anybody believes that the central scenario is going to actually occur. Nobody believes that. I don't even think financial market people believe that. Right, or at least nobody who's worked in the financial markets for more than a few months is going to believe that. So that's a bit of a red herring, it seems to me, that sort of problem. It does, it's true for all the reasons that Charles said, focuses people on this one set of numbers, which may or may not be representative of what's going on, and likely is not really that representative of what's going on. And that is, in my view, a genuine downside of having a baseline. On the other hand, at the end of the day, I could just repeat, at the end of the day, you have to tell, I think you should tell, in the name of transparency, in the name of good policy making, you should tell markets why you did what you did, somehow. Central scenario is not necessarily the best way of doing that. It may not even be helpful for all the reasons that Charles laid out. But you need something that tells them, the end of the day, that tells them what you did and why you did it. And then next time you're going to tell them again what you did, and the next time and the next time. I don't think there's any way around that. And you have to come up with some sort of mechanism that is fairly exact. I mean, it's got to be informative. Fairly, you can't just say, well, the world's really uncertain, so we just made a decision arbitrarily. You can't say that. You've got to say that we think certain things are gonna, this is the way the world looks, and that's why we made the decision we made. And I think that should be the focus of this discussion, not whether anybody thinks the thing is how best to construct a process. I think this is what you're doing. This isn't a criticism of what you're doing. I think this is what you're doing. But how to set up a process, and at the end, most importantly, a communication strategy that tells them that. You don't want to make them have to guess at what the central bank's doing. That's criminology. You want to tell them somehow that what the central bank is doing. And I think, to me, that is the touchstone of all of this. Anything that tells them, you got to make the right decisions, of course. That's a separate sort of issue. But in terms of this sort of thing, you got to communicate what you're doing and why you did it, and in a clear, sort of transparent, and that includes a bit of precision. You can say that the world's uncertain as you want, but in the end of the day, you made a decision, and they have a right to ask. I think they should ask, why did you do that? That's my.
So Vahe, so we've been spending a lot of time like writing monetary policy reports and so on. So we would love to actually get your comments on that, Bob and Charles as well. But so we'll send that stuff to you. We're running out of time here, and I wanted to just add one more thing. This is very much related to Charles' point about macroprudential and so on. So the analytical framework that we're developing for Mark II has nonlinearities in it. Okay, it has objective functions for policy and so on, and it has occasionally binding constraints. Okay, so those policy problems are very useful for thinking about macroprudential policies, fiscal policies, and so the nice thing here, Charles, is that by having an analytical framework, it's open source in Dynair Julia. So Michel Gilliard is online right now. He's been helping us to develop a modeling system called Dynair Julia for monetary, fiscal, and macroprudential policies. Okay, so that's going to be a big plus if we're using the same kind of toolbox for dealing with those three different types of policies. So Asya is going to be giving us kind of daily updates about where that project is going. There's going to be some hands-on training, Asya, at next week, I believe. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. But let me open it up to the floor. Are there any questions that anybody would like to ask to any of the panelists? Hasmek, Charles, Bob, Vahe, any questions out there or comments?
Well, I'd like to pick up something that Charles said about this. That I think he's right that inevitably, irrespective of the exact bureaucratic or legal framework, monetary policy and financial stability are now these days inextricable in some sense, right? Even if somebody else is formally responsible for it, or it's all in the central bank. And monetary policy, it's clear now, has the power, that's my funny way of putting it, has the power to affect financial market conditions, maybe for good, maybe for bad. And I mean, I'm not too sure. I mean, ideally, he's right. What you should do is combine them together into one big thing. I'm not sure about the practicality of that. For practical policymaking purposes, you might want to separate that. Certainly, from my understanding of your sort of FPAS framework, that's built into your FPAS framework. I mean, there was one slide that Asya put up that said there, that the inflation target is always more important. That the monetary stability target never overrides the inflation target. I don't think that's right. I can't imagine it being sensible to run a monetary policy that you knew was going to cause a financial crisis, right? I mean, taken literally, that's what you might want. That's what that rule might mean. And to me, that's not very sensible. So, I mean, I think it's worth thinking about more about exactly how you view that nexus between those two things. I think it's difficult and very dependent on the exact situation. What you might call nonlinearities.
I agree with that entirely. I think that, in a sense, what comes out of this to me is that although what you were doing, certainly in my view, is absolutely correct, where the real problems arise not so much in actually doing the scenarios, but communicating what you were doing and how you reached the decision as a result of that. And Robert is absolutely right. You've got to be able to communicate the reason for taking a decision. And how do you best do that? And I haven't, I'm afraid, read all of the material that you've provided, but I think a focus on how you communicate is really crucial to your success over time.
I think maybe Vahe, we can actually maybe try to arrange something with Charles so we can maybe take him through what our plans are and get his feedback on that.
For a couple of weeks, please. I'm too busy. November,
Okay.
no, not October.
Okay. Anyway, we appreciate you taking the time and all of you, Bob and Jose and Hasvik and so on. So thank you very much for the wonderful and interesting discussions today. And thanks a lot, Charles, for popping in. It was very special.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.